In a small, quiet town, there lived a man who was blind from birth. To most people, he seemed ordinary, going about his days quietly, moving carefully through streets and homes, and speaking softly to those he met. But beneath his calm and humble appearance, he carried a gift that very few could imagine. This gift was not visible, like a trophy or a painting. It was something that came from deep within, something that could touch hearts without a single word. It was music, and the piano was his voice. From a young age, he had been drawn to the sound of instruments. Even as a child, while other kids were running and playing outside, he would sit quietly and listen. He could tell the difference between the soft hum of a flute and the bright call of a violin just by hearing them. But it was the piano that called to him the most. There was something about the wide, black and white keys, the way each note could hold emotion and tell a story, that fascinated him. He couldn't see the instrument, but he could feel it, and he could imagine it in his mind as clearly as anyone could see a painting on a wall. His parents had noticed his special connection to music early on. They saved every penny they could to buy him a small second-hand piano when he was just 7 years old. The piano sat in the corner of their small living room, its wood scratched and worn, but to him, it was a treasure. He would spend hours each day sitting at that piano, exploring the keys, discovering the different sounds each finger could make. At first, he played slowly, testing each note, learning to remember the positions by feel and memory. He learned to play songs that other children only heard on the radio. But he wasn't just copying the notes. Even at that young age, there was a feeling in his music, a depth that surprised those who listened. School was always a challenge for him. He could read Braille and attend classes, but most of the teachers didn't understand how to encourage his talents. Some even doubted that someone without sight could become skilled in music. Many of his classmates were kind, but others could be cruel. He would sometimes hear whispers, comments about how he would never achieve much because he was blind. He tried to ignore them, focusing on the music that gave him peace and joy. Each note he played was like a secret message to himself, a reassurance that he could do something special even if the world didn't believe in him. As he grew older, his connection to the piano deepened. He could play songs that told stories without a single word. Sometimes, he would sit in his room late at night, the moonlight shining faintly through the curtains, and play music that expressed feelings he couldn't put into sentences. His mother, who often listened from the doorway, would sometimes cry quietly, moved by the beauty and emotion in his music. She knew he was special, but she also knew that the world outside was not always kind to those who were different. One evening, a friend of the family suggested he try playing for a small gathering at a local community center. The man was hesitant at first. He had never played in front of anyone outside his family. The thought made his hands shake slightly, but he agreed. The night of the gathering, he walked into the room carefully, guided by a friend. The small audience looked at him, some with curiosity, some with doubt. They saw a blind man approach a piano and wondered what he could possibly play. When his fingers touched the keys, the room fell silent. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, but then they grew stronger, flowing smoothly like water. Each note seemed to speak directly to the heart, and the listeners couldn't help but be drawn in. Some closed their eyes to focus, while others simply watched in awe. It wasn't just that he played the music perfectly. It was the way he made them feel. The music seemed to tell stories of hope, struggle, and courage, all without a single word. By the time he finished, there was a moment of complete silence, and then the room erupted into applause. People were astonished. They had not expected such talent from someone who couldn't see. From that day on, he began to realize that his music could reach beyond his own heart. He could touch the lives of others, even change the way they felt about their own struggles. He didn't play for fame or recognition. He played because it was his way of communicating, of sending messages that words could never fully express. Each note was intentional, each melody a story. He started to experiment more, creating compositions that carried messages of hope, courage, and resilience. Life wasn't always easy. He faced challenges every day, from navigating the streets to dealing with people who doubted his abilities. But the piano remained his constant companion, his friend and confidant. He discovered that through music, he could express the feelings he kept hidden from the world. Each day at the piano was an adventure, a journey into emotion, memory, and imagination. And as he played, he began to understand something important. Even without sight, he could see the world in a way that others could not. Through sound, he could observe, feel, and communicate in ways that were more powerful than vision alone. Neighbors began to notice his talent. Some would stop by just to listen, leaving quietly so as not to disturb him. They would leave with tears in their eyes, or a smile, or a sense of peace they hadn't felt before. Word started to spread about the blind man who could play the piano like no one else. People began to come from nearby towns to hear him play, curious about the magic that seemed to flow from his fingers. Even in moments of hardship, like when the piano keys would stick or the old stool would wobble, he never let frustration take over. He learned to adapt, to work with what he had, and to keep creating beauty despite obstacles. His determination became part of his story, showing everyone who listened that challenges could be transformed into something powerful if faced with patience and creativity. One day, a music teacher from a larger city heard about him. She came to listen, expecting a skilled player, but she was unprepared for the depth of emotion in his music. After listening to him for hours, she said that his playing was not just technically impressive. It was almost like he was sending messages to people's souls. That was when it became clear to him that his gift was bigger than just personal enjoyment. It could inspire, heal, and change lives. Even with recognition beginning to grow, he remained humble. He didn't ask for applause or praise. He simply played, letting the music speak for itself. He continued to live quietly, respecting the simplicity of his daily life, but now with a new understanding. The piano was more than an instrument. It was a way to connect, a way to communicate emotions and stories that could touch anyone, anywhere. And so, in that quiet town, the blind man and his piano became inseparable. He spent each day exploring new melodies, experimenting with rhythms, and finding new ways to express what he felt inside. Each note he played was a message, each chord a story. Through music, he had discovered a way to reach the world, to be seen and understood without ever needing sight. And though the journey had just begun, one thing was certain. His life and the lives of those who heard him would never be the same again. After the small gathering at the community center, word about the blind pianist began to spread slowly but surely. People in the town started talking about the man whose music seemed to reach the deepest parts of the heart. Some were curious, some skeptical, but everyone agreed that his talent was extraordinary. Despite the growing attention, he continued his simple life, rising early, walking carefully through the familiar streets, and spending long hours at the piano. Yet now there was a new awareness in the air. Strangers began to appear at his door, hesitant and unsure, just to hear the music they had heard so much about. One day, a local cafe owner asked him to play during the weekend. The man hesitated, unsure if he wanted a crowd in a public place. The thought of strangers watching him made him nervous. But he agreed, deciding that if he could touch even one person with his music, it would be worth it. On the day of the performance, the cafe was filled with people from all over the town. Some standing, some sitting, all waiting quietly. He walked to the piano with his usual calm and placed his hands on the keys. At first, the notes were soft and tentative, like a gentle greeting. Then, slowly, the melody unfolded, flowing from his fingertips like water over smooth stones. The audience listened, mesmerized, feeling as if the music was speaking directly to them, carrying messages they couldn't quite put into words. Among the listeners was an elderly man who had recently lost his wife. He had been feeling lost, struggling to find meaning in daily life. As the blind pianist played, the man felt a sense of peace and comfort he hadn't known in months. The notes seemed to wrap around him, as if the piano itself understood his pain and offered solace. Tears filled his eyes, and he whispered softly to himself, amazed at how someone could understand sorrow without ever seeing the world through his eyes. Across the room, a young woman sat quietly, listening to each note. She had been uncertain about her future, worried about choices she had to make, and unsure of her own abilities. By the time the song ended, she felt a new sense of hope and determination. The music had sent a message, one that encouraged her to believe in herself. The blind pianist began to notice that people were reacting to his music in ways he had never expected. Each performance was different, not because he played differently, but because every listener brought their own experiences, fears, and hopes. The piano became a channel for communication, a bridge between his world and the lives of others. Some people came to him repeatedly, not just for entertainment, but because the music seemed to send messages that were deeply personal. They felt that through his playing, he understood things that they could not express themselves. Encouraged by these experiences, he started experimenting more. He played melodies that were light and joyful, notes that lifted spirits and created smiles. Other times, he explored somber and reflective tones, allowing listeners to confront their own feelings and find release. Each piece became more than just music. It was a story, a conversation without words. He realized that the piano could express emotions and messages in a way that speech could not. People were not just hearing the music. They were feeling it, understanding it on a level that reached beyond the mind and touched the heart. One afternoon, a schoolteacher brought a group of students to hear him play. The children were initially curious but shy, unsure what to expect. They had never seen someone play the piano without looking at the keys, and the idea fascinated them. When the blind pianist began to play, the room became silent. The children listened in awe, some with wide eyes, others leaning forward as if trying to catch every note. The music seemed to teach without lessons, to communicate wisdom without words. The teacher watched quietly, realizing that this was more than just a performance. It was an education in empathy, emotion, and the power of expression. During this time, the blind pianist faced challenges as well. Not everyone was supportive. Some questioned why he received attention, doubting that a person without sight could possess such skill. Others were jealous, feeling that the attention he received should have gone to someone else. He encountered moments of discouragement, but each time he returned to the piano, he found strength in the music itself. The piano never judged, never doubted, and never failed to provide comfort. It was his constant companion, his safe place, and his tool to reach the world. Slowly, he began to understand the power of what he was doing. His music could influence emotions, inspire hope, and change perspectives. People started to come to him with personal stories, sharing how a song he had played had given them courage during a difficult time. A young man told him that after hearing a particular melody, he had found the confidence to pursue his dream job. A mother explained that a lullaby-like tune had helped her daughter overcome fear and sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Each story reinforced the realization that his music was sending signals, messages that had the potential to change lives in ways he had never imagined. The blind pianist began to carefully consider each piece he played. He realized that he could shape his music to convey messages intentionally, not just express emotions randomly. He experimented with rhythm, tempo, and dynamics, understanding that subtle changes could alter the emotional impact profoundly. Each performance became a dialogue with the audience, a series of messages hidden within melodies, carefully crafted to communicate feelings and thoughts without a single word. The realization thrilled him, and he dedicated more time to exploring this hidden language of music. One day, a journalist from a nearby city came to hear him play. She had heard stories about the blind man whose piano seemed to speak to souls and wanted to understand the phenomenon for herself. She observed quietly as he played, fascinated by the depth of emotion conveyed through his fingertips. After the performance, she approached him and asked how he felt about what he was doing. He smiled gently and explained that he never intended to be famous or admired. He simply wanted to share what he felt inside, to offer messages of hope, comfort, and courage to anyone willing to listen. The journalist left deeply moved, inspired to share his story with a larger audience. As more people learned about him, invitations came from nearby towns and cities. Some wanted him to play at gatherings, community events, and even schools. Each new opportunity brought a mix of excitement and nervousness. He was not used to travel or performing in unfamiliar settings, but he continued, motivated by the impact his music had on others. Wherever he went, people were touched by the messages in his music, and his reputation as a blind pianist who communicated through melody grew steadily. Despite the growing attention, he remained humble and focused on the music itself. He did not seek praise or awards. For him, the joy was in the connection he could create, in the lives he could touch through the piano. He often reflected on the quiet moments in his room, practicing and exploring melodies, and he realized that those solitary hours were as important as the performances in front of an audience. It was in those quiet moments that he discovered the true depth of his gift. By the end of this period, the blind pianist had begun to recognize a profound truth. Music was not just sound. It was a way of speaking directly to the human spirit. Each note carried meaning, each melody a message, and each performance an opportunity to touch hearts. People began to approach him not just as a musician, but as someone who could send messages through music that words often failed to express. He had found a unique way to connect with the world, and his journey was only beginning. The quiet man from a small town, who had once been underestimated and doubted, was becoming a messenger through his piano, and the lives he touched were proof that the power of music could change everything. As time passed, the blind pianist's music began to carry a new power. It was no longer just melodies that entertained. It became a language, a way to send messages that resonated deeply with those who listened. He noticed that some people came to him again and again, sitting quietly in the audience, waiting for a song that seemed written just for them. They did not speak much, but the connection was clear. The piano became more than an instrument. It was a bridge, linking him to hearts and minds in ways words could never reach. One afternoon, he received a letter from a teacher at a local school. She wrote that her students were struggling with confidence and motivation. She had heard about the blind pianist and asked if he would come to play for them. At first, he was hesitant, unsure how children would respond to his music. But he agreed, thinking that if he could inspire even one child, it would be worthwhile. When he arrived, the students were restless and skeptical. They whispered among themselves, not expecting much. But the moment his fingers touched the keys, a transformation began. The room grew quiet, every ear tuned to the soft, deliberate notes. Slowly, the music wrapped around the students, speaking to feelings they could not yet express. Some were moved to tears, others to smiles, and gradually, the whispers turned to thoughtful silence. They began to understand that music could be a friend, a guide, and a teacher. It became clear that the messages in his music were not random. Through careful practice, he had learned how to express encouragement, hope, and strength in ways that touched people at their core. A young boy who had been shy and withdrawn began to participate in class, inspired by the courage he felt from hearing a melody that seemed to speak directly to him. A girl who had struggled with fear of failure gained confidence to try out for the school play. The blind pianist's music was creating real change, and he began to see the potential for his gift to reach even further. Word of his unique talent spread beyond the town. Invitations arrived from nearby cities, asking him to play at gatherings, events, and even hospitals. He discovered that his music had a remarkable effect on patients, comforting those in pain, calming anxious minds, and providing solace where words could not. A nurse told him that a patient recovering from surgery had fallen asleep listening to his music for the first time in days. Another shared that a child with severe anxiety had smiled and laughed while he played. Each of these experiences confirmed what he had felt all along, that music was more than sound. It was a form of communication that could touch lives in profound ways. With each performance, the blind pianist began to notice patterns. Certain melodies could soothe sadness, while others could inspire courage. Slow, gentle tones often brought comfort, while rising, energetic sequences seemed to ignite determination. He began to experiment intentionally, shaping his compositions to carry specific messages. It was as if the piano had become a tool for storytelling without words, a medium through which he could send signals of hope, reassurance, and strength to anyone willing to listen. The impact of his music reached unexpected places. One day, a man who had recently lost his job attended a performance. The melody spoke to his frustration and fear, but it also carried a sense of perseverance and new beginnings. By the end, the man left feeling inspired, ready to face challenges with renewed determination. Another listener, a young woman facing family difficulties, found comfort and courage in a song that seemed to echo her own struggles, offering a message that she was not alone. These experiences taught him that his music had a language of its own, one that could communicate across barriers and touch lives in ways he had never imagined. As he continued to perform, he realized that the true power of his gift was not in technical skill alone, but in the emotions he could convey. He experimented with silence as well as sound, learning that pauses and soft notes could communicate as strongly as dramatic chords. Each performance became a dialogue, a conversation with invisible threads connecting him to the audience. People left with something more than entertainment. They left with a feeling of understanding, empathy, and inspiration that stayed with them long after the music ended. The blind pianist's growing reputation attracted attention from journalists and media outlets. Stories appeared about the man who could touch hearts without seeing the world. Many were curious about how a blind man could achieve such mastery and convey such profound emotion. He remained humble, often downplaying his skill, insisting that he simply played what he felt. Yet, as more people shared their experiences, it became clear that his music carried something extraordinary. Audiences reported feelings of comfort, courage, and hope after listening, and they marveled at how he could communicate without words. Despite the attention, the blind pianist continued his daily routine with quiet determination. He still practiced for hours, experimenting with melodies, rhythms, and dynamics. Every day brought new discoveries about how to express emotion through sound. He reflected on the lives he had touched and the stories he had heard, realizing that the music had become a powerful way to communicate what words often failed to convey. Each key he pressed was part of a language that transcended sight, voice, and conventional communication. He also began to notice how his own understanding of the world had grown. Because he experienced life differently, he could sense emotions, intentions, and energy in ways that others might overlook. His music reflected these perceptions, carrying subtle messages that listeners often interpreted personally. Each performance was unique, a tailored expression influenced by the people present, the setting, and even the time of day. The piano became a mirror, reflecting both his feelings and the emotions of those who listened. The blind pianist's dedication inspired others to explore their own creativity. Musicians and non-musicians alike were encouraged by his example, realizing that challenges could be transformed into opportunities for expression and connection. Local schools began to emphasize music programs, inspired by the impact his performances had on students. Families started bringing children to hear him play, hoping they could experience the same sense of wonder and emotional insight. The ripple effect of his music extended far beyond the notes themselves, influencing communities and fostering empathy and understanding. Through all this, he remained aware of the responsibility that came with his gift. Each note, each melody, had the power to affect someone deeply, and he approached his performances with care and intention. He learned to listen to the reactions of the audience, adjusting the flow and tone to ensure that his music communicated the right message. It was a delicate balance, requiring both technical skill and emotional sensitivity. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It had become a messenger, a voice for those who could not express themselves. As he reflected on his journey, he realized that his music had already changed many lives, including his own. The challenges he faced as a blind person had shaped his understanding of resilience, empathy, and the power of expression. Every note he played carried a piece of his own story, but it also carried the stories of those who listened, creating a shared experience that transcended individual limitations. His gift had become a way to communicate hope, courage, and understanding, connecting people across distances and differences. By the end of this period, the blind pianist had discovered a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. Music was more than sound, more than performance, more than skill. It was a language that could heal, inspire, and connect. Through the piano, he could send messages that touched hearts, changed perspectives, and brought light to those in darkness. Each performance was a new opportunity to communicate, to share, and to make a difference. And as he played, he understood that his journey had only just begun, with endless possibilities for the messages he could send and the lives he could touch. The blind pianist's reputation grew steadily, and soon invitations to play at larger venues began to arrive. One day, he received a request to perform at a town hall meeting attended by influential members of the community. The thought made him nervous. Performing in front of people he did not know, with expectations unknown to him, was different from the quiet gatherings he had grown used to. Yet he knew that if he could send his message through music, even to one person, it would be worth stepping into this unfamiliar space. On the day of the performance, he entered the hall quietly, guided by a friend. The room was filled with people, their faces curious, some skeptical, some expectant. As he approached the piano, he felt a mixture of nerves and determination. Sitting on the bench, he let his hands hover above the keys for a moment, feeling the texture of the wood and the smoothness of each key. Then he began to play. The first notes were gentle, almost like a greeting, acknowledging the presence of every listener. Gradually, the melody grew, rising and falling with emotion, carrying messages that were invisible yet undeniable. The audience listened in silence, captivated by the music that spoke directly to their hearts. Among the crowd was a city council member who had been dealing with personal and professional challenges. The melody seemed to resonate with his inner struggles, providing clarity and calm. He leaned forward, eyes closed, feeling the message behind each note. It was not simply music. It was guidance, understanding, and reassurance. A young woman sitting nearby, unsure about a decision she had to make regarding her career, found courage in the same notes. The music seemed to speak to her doubts and fears, offering encouragement and a sense of direction she had not anticipated. It became clear that the blind pianist was not merely entertaining. He was sending signals that influenced the hearts and minds of those who listened. After the performance, the hall was quiet for a moment, the echoes of the music still lingering in the air. Then, applause began, growing steadily until the entire room was clapping and cheering. People came forward, some with tears in their eyes, thanking him for the way the music had touched them. The blind pianist smiled gently, humbled by the response, yet quietly aware that the true impact of his music was felt in the moments that could not be seen, the personal, silent transformations within each listener. Following this event, more opportunities began to open up. A local newspaper ran a story about him, highlighting how a blind man could communicate powerful messages through the piano. Other journalists and media outlets took notice, wanting to tell his story and share the music with a wider audience. Despite the growing attention, he remained focused on the purpose of his gift: to connect, communicate, and inspire through music. Fame was never the goal. The messages embedded in the melodies were what mattered most. During this time, he also began to collaborate with other musicians. A violinist and a cellist approached him, wanting to perform together. At first, he was unsure how this would work, concerned about losing control over the message in his music. But as they rehearsed, he realized that the collaboration added depth and richness, enhancing the emotional signals he wished to convey. The combination of instruments created layers of communication, allowing listeners to feel a more complex range of emotions. Audiences were not just hearing music. They were experiencing a conversation, a story unfolding through sound. One particularly memorable event took place in a hospital. The pianist had been invited to play in a ward where patients were recovering from serious illnesses. As he played, the atmosphere transformed. The gentle, flowing notes calmed anxious hearts, eased pain, and brought a sense of peace to those who were struggling. Nurses and doctors observed quietly, noticing how patients responded with relaxation, smiles, or even tears of relief. The blind pianist realized that his music could provide comfort and healing beyond entertainment. It could be a source of solace in moments of fear and uncertainty. The blind pianist also discovered that his music could bridge divides and foster understanding. He played at community events where people from different backgrounds, experiences, and beliefs came together. The music created a shared experience that transcended differences. Arguments and tensions seemed to soften as the melodies filled the space, and people connected through the universal language of sound. It was a reminder that human emotions were the same, regardless of age, status, or perspective, and that music could serve as a gentle messenger of empathy and unity. Despite these successes, he remained aware of the responsibility he carried. He knew that the notes he played could affect people profoundly, and he approached every performance with care. He experimented with dynamics, tempo, and phrasing to ensure that the emotional signals were clear and intentional. Sometimes he would adjust mid-performance, guided by the reactions he sensed from the audience. It was a delicate process, balancing expression with perception, but it became a skill that allowed him to communicate effectively without sight, relying entirely on intuition, experience, and connection. The blind pianist also began to mentor others who were interested in exploring music as a form of communication. He encouraged young musicians to think beyond technical skill, to focus on conveying emotion and meaning through their playing. He shared his understanding that music was a language that could inspire, heal, and connect people. Students learned not just to play notes, but to listen to the responses of their audience, to feel the impact of every chord, and to recognize the power of intentional expression. As he performed more widely, the blind pianist's influence grew. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and cultural events, sharing his experiences and insights. Audiences were fascinated not only by his musical skill but by the depth of his understanding of human emotion. He spoke about the power of music to send messages, to touch lives, and to inspire change. Many were inspired to look at their own abilities differently, realizing that challenges could be transformed into opportunities for meaningful contribution. In the midst of growing recognition, he never lost sight of the simplicity that had guided him from the beginning. He continued to practice daily, experimenting with melodies, exploring rhythms, and discovering new ways to convey messages through sound. Every day was a chance to refine his gift, to reach deeper into the hearts of those who listened. He understood that the true measure of his success was not applause or fame, but the quiet impact his music had on the lives of individuals. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, a woman approached him. She explained that she had been struggling with loss and grief, and that his music had given her comfort and hope. She described feeling as though the piano had spoken directly to her, sending a message that she was not alone. The blind pianist listened quietly, humbled and moved by her words. It was moments like these that reminded him why he continued to play, why he dedicated himself to sending messages through music. The turning point in his journey was the realization that his music had the power to transform not only the emotions of listeners but also their actions. He had seen people gain courage, find hope, and reconnect with themselves through the melodies he played. It was a responsibility he did not take lightly. Each performance became an opportunity to inspire, to communicate a message of resilience, compassion, and understanding. The piano had become his voice, and he used it with intention and care. By the end of this period, the blind pianist had reached a new level of awareness about his gift. He had discovered that music was not just entertainment or expression. It was a language, a way to send signals that could change lives. Through careful attention, intention, and connection, he had learned to use the piano to communicate in a profound and meaningful way. The quiet man from a small town had become a messenger, reaching hearts and minds in ways that words alone could never achieve. And as he continued to play, he understood that the journey was far from over, with countless lives yet to touch and countless messages yet to send. By the time the blind pianist reached the next stage of his journey, the effects of his music were beginning to ripple through the lives of many. People he had never met personally were touched by the stories of those who had listened to him. Families shared tales of hope and courage that had been inspired by his melodies, and communities began to recognize the power of music as a force for change. It was no longer just about skill or talent. It was about connection, emotion, and transformation. One day, he received a letter from a woman living in another city. She wrote about her son, a young boy who had been struggling with anxiety and fear of social situations. He had become withdrawn, avoiding school and social interactions, and the family felt helpless. After hearing about the blind pianist, they played recordings of his performances for the boy. Slowly, he began to respond. The music seemed to speak directly to him, offering comfort and courage. Over time, the boy gained confidence, started attending school again, and even participated in small community events. The mother's letter described the transformation as almost miraculous, a testament to the power of music to communicate messages that words could not. Encouraged by stories like this, the pianist began to explore ways to reach more people. He traveled to nearby towns and cities, performing at schools, community centers, and hospitals. Each performance brought new experiences and new lives touched. A nurse in a pediatric ward shared how children who had been afraid or in pain were soothed by the melodies, calming their fears and bringing smiles to their faces. In another town, a group of elderly residents found comfort and nostalgia in the familiar tunes he played, sparking memories and conversations that had been long forgotten. The pianist began to understand that his gift was not limited to any age or situation. Music could communicate across generations, cultures, and experiences. One afternoon, during a performance at a community event, a young woman approached him afterward. She explained that she had been struggling with self-doubt and had been considering leaving her studies. Hearing the music had given her strength and clarity, showing her that she was capable and resilient. She smiled with gratitude, telling him that his melodies had sent a message that changed her perspective. The blind pianist listened quietly, humbled and inspired by her words. It became clear to him that his music was not only touching emotions but also guiding actions, helping people make decisions and find their own courage. In addition to public performances, the pianist began to create recordings of his music, hoping that even those who could not attend in person could experience the messages in his melodies. He carefully considered each piece, thinking about how the music might affect listeners, what emotions it could evoke, and what signals it might send. Each recording was a story, a conversation, a gift. Families played them at home, students listened before exams, and people in hospitals found comfort during recovery. The reach of his music grew far beyond what he had ever imagined, connecting lives in ways that transcended distance and circumstance. During this time, he also noticed the power of music to heal emotional wounds. A man who had recently lost his job confided that listening to the pianist's compositions had given him hope and motivation to keep trying. A woman recovering from illness said that the music helped her find peace and patience during her recovery. Each story reinforced the realization that his music carried messages that could uplift, inspire, and guide. It was a reminder that every note had potential to touch lives deeply, far beyond the immediate moment of performance. The blind pianist's influence began to extend into educational settings as well. Teachers invited him to speak to students about the power of creativity, resilience, and expression. He shared his journey, explaining how music had allowed him to communicate messages, connect with people, and change lives. Students were fascinated, realizing that talent alone was not enough. It was the intention behind actions and the courage to share one's gift that truly mattered. Young musicians began to explore the emotional language of music, learning that every note could be a signal, every melody a story. Community leaders and organizers took note of his impact. They realized that music could serve as a bridge, connecting people across differences and fostering understanding. He was invited to perform at events aimed at bringing communities together, promoting empathy and unity. During these gatherings, the music seemed to dissolve barriers, creating shared experiences that transcended age, background, and belief. People left feeling connected, inspired, and motivated to approach life with more compassion and understanding. Despite growing recognition and impact, the blind pianist remained humble and focused on the music itself. Each day, he practiced, explored new melodies, and refined his ability to communicate messages through sound. He understood that the power of his gift came not just from skill but from intention, empathy, and connection. Each performance was a dialogue, each note a signal, and each melody an opportunity to touch a life in a meaningful way. He also began to mentor aspiring musicians, teaching them that music was more than notes on a page. He encouraged them to focus on the emotional and communicative power of their playing. Students learned that the ability to convey messages through music required listening deeply, feeling emotions, and understanding the impact of every choice. This approach inspired a new generation of musicians to think beyond technical mastery, to embrace the role of music as a language that could heal, guide, and inspire. Throughout this period, the blind pianist continued to face challenges. Travel, public performances, and interactions with large audiences were often exhausting. There were moments of doubt, when he wondered if the messages were truly reaching people or making a difference. But every story he heard, every expression of gratitude, reminded him of the value of his gift. It was not about recognition or fame. It was about connection, communication, and transformation. Each life touched, each heart moved, reaffirmed his purpose. One particularly moving experience occurred when he played at a rehabilitation center for adults recovering from trauma. A woman shared that she had felt isolated and hopeless, but the music had provided comfort and a sense of belonging. A man recovering from addiction described feeling a spark of hope he had not experienced in years. The pianist realized that his music had become a source of resilience, a way to encourage people to believe in themselves and their capacity to heal. It was proof that melodies could carry messages that words often failed to deliver. Over time, the blind pianist began to see the full extent of his impact. People wrote letters, shared stories, and returned to hear him play again, inspired by the messages they felt through his music. Families found unity, students discovered courage, patients experienced comfort, and entire communities were touched by the language of his melodies. The piano, once a quiet companion in a small room, had become a messenger, carrying signals of hope, strength, and compassion far and wide. Through all of this, the pianist maintained his quiet, humble lifestyle. He remained devoted to practice, reflection, and exploration, constantly seeking new ways to communicate messages through music. Each note was chosen with intention, each melody crafted to resonate with emotion and meaning. He understood that the true value of his gift lay not in the applause or recognition, but in the lives changed and hearts touched. By the end of this period, the blind pianist had witnessed the transformative power of his music on countless individuals. He had seen fear replaced by courage, despair replaced by hope, and isolation replaced by connection. Every story he heard reinforced the truth that music was more than sound. It was a language, a signal, and a source of inspiration. The melodies he created carried messages that could heal, guide, and empower. And as he continued to play, he realized that the journey of sending signals that changed everything was still unfolding, with many more lives to touch and messages to share. As the years passed, the blind pianist's influence continued to grow. His music had reached countless people, touching hearts and changing lives in ways that words alone could never accomplish. Every performance carried messages that inspired hope, courage, and resilience. Through his music, he had become more than just a musician. He had become a messenger, a guide, and a source of comfort for those who needed it most. He continued to travel, though always cautiously, visiting schools, hospitals, community centers, and public events. Each venue offered a new opportunity to communicate through the piano, to send messages that could uplift spirits and inspire change. No matter where he went, people felt the power of his music. The melodies he created seemed to reach into the hearts of listeners, touching emotions that often went unspoken. Parents brought children who were shy or fearful, seeking a sense of courage. Patients in recovery found peace in the notes he played. Students struggling with confidence discovered the motivation to pursue their dreams. The pianist realized that his music had become a universal language, understood by people of all ages and backgrounds. Despite the recognition and influence he was gaining, he remained humble. He never sought fame or rewards. His focus was always on the music and the messages it carried. Every practice session, every composition, every performance was an opportunity to connect and communicate. He believed that the true value of his gift was measured not by applause or praise but by the lives he touched and the hearts he moved. One afternoon, he was invited to play at a large auditorium in a nearby city. The audience was filled with people from diverse backgrounds, some who had heard of him through stories and others who were experiencing his music for the first time. As he sat at the piano, he felt a familiar calm. His fingers touched the keys, and the first notes began to flow. The melody was gentle yet powerful, filled with emotion and intent. It spoke of resilience, hope, and the strength found in adversity. As the music continued, the audience was captivated. Some closed their eyes, letting the notes wash over them. Others sat in quiet reflection, absorbing the messages hidden within each chord. It was a moment of connection that transcended language and circumstance, a shared experience that united every listener. After the performance, people approached him with gratitude and stories of how the music had affected them. A young woman explained that she had been struggling with grief, and hearing the pianist's melodies had given her comfort and perspective. An elderly man shared that the music reminded him of moments of joy and love from his past, bringing a sense of peace he had not felt in years. A teenager, nervous about an upcoming examination, said the performance had given him confidence and motivation. The blind pianist listened quietly, humbled by their words, realizing that the true impact of his music was in these personal connections and transformations. He also noticed how his music was inspiring others to explore their own gifts and express themselves creatively. Students who had attended his performances began to experiment with music, painting, writing, and other forms of art. They understood that expression was not limited by talent or circumstance. It was about communicating what was in their hearts. Teachers reported that their students were more confident, empathetic, and motivated after experiencing his performances. The blind pianist recognized that his gift had a ripple effect, inspiring creativity, courage, and understanding in ways that extended far beyond his direct audience. As his influence expanded, he began to reflect on his journey. From the quiet boy who had discovered a piano in a small living room to the man who now played for thousands, he understood that every challenge he had faced had shaped his ability to communicate through music. His blindness, which many had once seen as a limitation, had become a source of unique perception, allowing him to sense emotion, intention, and energy in ways others could not. The piano was his medium, but the message came from his heart, a language of empathy, hope, and connection. He also understood the importance of intention in his music. Every note, every chord, every pause had meaning. He approached each performance with care, considering the emotions of his audience and the message he wished to convey. Over time, he had developed a deep sensitivity, able to adapt his music in real time based on the reactions he sensed. This ability made each performance unique, a dialogue between the pianist and those who listened. Music had become more than entertainment. It was a tool for communication, healing, and inspiration. The blind pianist's story began to reach even wider audiences. Journalists, writers, and broadcasters shared his journey, highlighting not only his musical talent, but the messages and impact embedded in his performances. People across cities and regions heard about the man who could touch hearts through music, and invitations poured in for concerts, workshops, and collaborations. Despite this, he remained grounded, continuing to live simply and focusing on the core purpose of his gift, sending meaningful signals through music. Throughout this journey, he encountered challenges as well. Traveling, performing in new environments, and managing expectations were sometimes exhausting. There were moments of doubt and worry, questioning whether his music was truly making a difference. Yet, each story of gratitude, each personal transformation he witnessed, reinforced his belief in the importance of his work. The messages his music carried were reaching people, inspiring courage, hope, and resilience. That was all that mattered. One of the most profound experiences occurred when he played at a community center for families facing hardship. The room was filled with children and parents, many struggling with economic and personal challenges. As he played, he observed faces soften, tension ease, and eyes brighten. A mother whispered that she felt hope for the first time in months. A young boy, who had been afraid to speak or participate, smiled and tapped his foot to the rhythm, feeling a sense of inclusion and joy. The pianist realized that his music could create moments of transformation, even in the most difficult circumstances. He continued to explore the depth and range of his music. He experimented with tempos, harmonies, and dynamics, understanding that subtle changes could significantly affect the emotional message. Slow, Gentle melodies offered comfort and reflection, while lively, rhythmic sequences inspired energy and determination. He discovered that the power of music lay not only in the notes themselves but in the intent behind them. The pianist had learned to send precise messages, using his talent as a tool to communicate with clarity and empathy. Over time, the blind pianist also mentored younger musicians, sharing the lessons he had learned about the emotional language of music. He taught them to listen deeply, to feel, and to understand the power of intention. Students learned that music was not only about technical skill but about the ability to communicate, inspire, and connect. They discovered that their own experiences and emotions could be transformed into messages that touched others, a realization that empowered them to embrace creativity with confidence and purpose. As his legacy continued to grow, the blind pianist reflected on the journey he had undertaken. From a small room in a quiet town to concert halls and community centers filled with people whose lives had been touched, he had learned that the true purpose of music was connection. The piano had become a voice, a messenger, and a bridge between hearts. Each life touched, each story of courage and hope, reinforced the understanding that music was a language capable of changing everything. In the end, the blind pianist realized that the most meaningful part of his journey was not the recognition or attention he received, but the countless individuals whose lives had been transformed by his music. People had found hope, courage, peace, and inspiration in the melodies he played. The messages embedded in each note had traveled far beyond the piano, creating ripples of positive impact across communities, families, and generations. He continued to play, knowing that the journey was never truly complete. There were always more lives to touch, more hearts to reach, and more messages to send. Through his music, he had discovered a way to communicate beyond words, to connect with people on a profound level, and to leave a lasting legacy of hope, compassion, and courage. The blind man and his piano had become a symbol of the extraordinary power of talent, intention, and empathy, showing that even in the face of challenges, one person could send signals that changed everything.